I am going to marry my girlfriend, and since we were never legally married, you will not be walking away with a single thing." He delivered that sentence the way he delivered a diagnosis to a patient, calm and clinical and certain. 10 years of my life dismissed in a single breath, 10 years of standing behind him while he climbed, 10 years of holding together everything that was not surgery. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply smiled, slid a thick yellow envelope across the patio table, and told him that for a doctor, he really did not read very carefully before signing. The color drained from his face the instant he looked inside, and for the first time in a decade, Dr. Garrett Brennan looked genuinely afraid of me. People imagine that betrayal arrives like a thunderclap, loud and impossible to miss, but in real life it almost never works that way. It seeps in slowly through the smallest cracks, through a text message that takes 3 hours longer than it should, through a dinner that gets skipped without a real explanation, through a smile that no longer touches the eyes of the person sitting across from you. I had been watching those cracks widen for a long time, without admitting what I was seeing, because admitting it would have required me to face a truth I was not yet ready to face. The morning he finally spoke the words out loud, I realized I had already known for months. Before I go further, I want to pause here for just a moment, because I know some of you are already feeling something tighten in your chest. If you have ever sat across from someone who looked at you like you were temporary, someone who spoke to you like your contributions were invisible, then this story is going to feel familiar in ways you did not expect. Please consider subscribing so the rest of this story can find you, and in the comments below, tell me about a moment when someone you trusted made you feel small for caring more than they did. I want to hear what you carried home that day, because I promise you that you are not the only one who has carried it. For years, I had explained Garrett's distance the way every loyal wife eventually learns to explain things. He was tired. He was operating on a difficult case. He had been on his feet for 14 hours and could barely string a sentence together by the time he walked through our front door. Orthopedic surgery is not a profession that respects evenings or weekends or birthdays, and the hospital schedule he kept was something close to brutal. So when he stopped asking about my day, I told myself he was exhausted. When he started guarding his phone like it held nuclear codes, I told myself he was dealing with patient privacy. When his cologne changed and a gym bag suddenly appeared in the back of his car, I told myself he was finally taking care of himself. Looking back now, every one of those small lies I told myself was a stone I was placing in the path of my own future. We lived in Naperville, Illinois, in a 2-story home with cream white siding, a 3-car garage, and a front lawn so carefully manicured that strangers slowed their cars to admire it. The house was the kind of place neighbors quietly envied while pretending not to, and Garrett loved that. He referred to it as his house with such consistency that I eventually stopped correcting him, not because the language was accurate, but because I had grown tired of the way his face hardened whenever I tried. I bought the curtains. I chose the paint colors. I negotiated with the contractor when the kitchen renovation went 6 weeks over schedule. But somewhere in the silent ledger Garrett kept inside his head, none of that counted, because none of it carried a surgeon's billing code. That Saturday morning began the way most of my Saturdays began. I woke up at 7, brewed a pot of coffee that smelled like the only honest thing in the house, and carried my mug out to the patio to watch the early light spread across the neighborhood. Autumn was just beginning to edge in, the trees turning at their corners, the air carrying that particular Midwestern crispness that always made me feel briefly grateful to be alive. Garrett came outside about 20 minutes later, and the moment I saw him, I knew something was wrong. He was not carrying a coffee cup. He was not carrying his phone, which never left his hand. He was carrying only himself, and he sat down across from me with the posture of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say. He said my name the way doctors say a patient's name before they deliver test results, gentle on the surface and heavy underneath. "Hollis," he began, and my stomach tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee. He looked past me toward the back fence rather than meeting my eyes, took one long breath, and told me he had been seeing someone. There was no shaking in his voice, no hesitation, no visible struggle. He delivered the sentence the way he delivered a clean incision, precise and unbothered. For several seconds, I simply looked at him, because I was not surprised. And that absence of surprise told me more about my marriage than anything else could have. The shock was not the affair. The shock was how little it cost him to admit it. I set my coffee mug down carefully on the glass tabletop and asked him how long, because I needed a number more than I needed an apology. A little over a year, he said. A year. 365 mornings of him kissing me on the forehead before he left for work. 365 evenings of him eating the dinners I prepared. 365 nights of him sleeping in the bed we shared, while another woman waited for his texts. He must have read my silence as composure, because he kept going, encouraged by the absence of tears. He told me he cared about her. He told me he loved her. And then he told me the sentence that revealed exactly who my husband had become. At some point I had failed to notice. I am going to marry her. Not if we divorced. Not someday in the future. Not maybe. He said it the way a man announces a decision that has already been finalized in a room I was never invited into. A younger version of me would have shattered at that table, would have begged for explanations, would have asked what she had that I did not. But something happens to a woman who has spent a decade quietly carrying the emotional weight of someone else's life. The grief does not arrive the way you expect. It arrives wearing the clothes of exhaustion, and underneath the exhaustion, something else begins to stir, something cold and clear and almost surgical in its own right. I looked at his expensive watch, his pressed weekend polo, his confidence, and I understood that he believed this conversation was already over. Then he delivered what he clearly considered the final, devastating blow. "We were never legally married," he said, and the certainty in his voice was almost impressive. He leaned forward to explain, as if I were a slow patient who needed the diagnosis broken into smaller words. He reminded me that we had once talked about doing the courthouse paperwork, that we had been so busy back then that he was almost positive we had never actually finished it, that there had been no legal filing. He spoke quickly now, building momentum, building his case. "So legally speaking," he said, "there is nothing to divide. The house, the investments, my retirement accounts, everything belongs to me." He kept saying my, the way a child says mine while clutching a toy, and I noticed the word the way I might notice a small bruise blooming on my own skin. He told me he did not want things to get ugly, which is always the sentence men use right before they reach for the knife. He offered to help me relocate. That was the exact word he used. Relocate. The way a manager might describe shuffling an employee to a different branch. He said he would give me some money to get started. Some money. After 10 years of being his partner, his planner, his bookkeeper, his quiet logistics department, his emotional support staff, his everything outside the operating room, he was offering me some money. I did not yell. I did not weep. I simply stood up from the patio chair without saying a word and walked back into the house, leaving him calling my name behind me. In the kitchen, I opened the second drawer beneath the microwave, the one Garrett had never opened in all the years we had lived in that house, because nothing inside it ever interested him. I lifted out a large yellow envelope, the kind with the metal clasp and the reinforced edges, and I held it for a moment in both hands. I had assembled the contents of that envelope slowly over many years, never with malice, never with a plan, simply with the careful attentiveness of a person who had learned early in life that paperwork outlives promises. I had hoped I would never need to slide it across a table. I had hoped Garrett would prove me wrong about the man he was becoming. He had just answered that hope with a single, casual sentence on a sunny patio. I walked back outside with the envelope tucked against my side and sat down across from him as though nothing had happened. He was already irritated, his patience visibly fraying at the edges, the calm of his earlier performance beginning to crack. "What is this?" he asked, and I simply slid the envelope across the glass tabletop until it rested against the edge of his hand. He frowned at it the way a man frowns at an unexpected bill. "What am I looking at?" he asked again. "Open it," I told him, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than it had been in years. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then unwound the metal clasp and pulled out the first document. His face moved through stages so quickly that I could almost have mapped them. The way medical students learn the stages of grief. First came the easy confidence of a man who expects to find something he can dismiss. Then came confusion, his eyebrows drawing together as he read more carefully. Then came concern, a small tightening around his mouth. And then came the moment I had been waiting for, the moment his eyes found the signature at the bottom of the page. His own signature, not similar to his signature, not a forgery, not a clever imitation, his actual signature, the same loops and slants he had been writing for 30 years, sitting in dark blue ink beneath an official marriage certificate that had been filed with the state of Illinois exactly 10 years earlier. He whispered the word no, and the word barely made it past his lips. He read the page again, then read it a third time, as if the document might rearrange itself if he stared at it hard enough. His hands were trembling now, not dramatically, just enough to make the paper rustle faintly in the morning air. "This is not real," he said. I leaned back in my chair and watched him quietly, the way you watch a building begin to settle into a foundation it cannot escape. "Look at the signature," I told him. He already was. His face had gone the color of cold ash, because the signature was the one part of the document he could not argue with. It was unmistakably his. He had signed it 10 years earlier in a courthouse hallway, between 2 work emails, without ever once asking what the paper said. Garrett finally lifted his eyes from the certificate and looked at me, really looked at me, and his next question came out so quietly I almost missed it. "What else," he asked, "is in this envelope?" I sat there for a long moment without answering him, watching the question hover in the air between us, like something he could not take back. It was, I realized, the first time in our entire decade together that Garrett had ever asked what was in a stack of papers before assuming he already knew. I almost wanted to congratulate him, the way you might congratulate a child for finally learning to tie his own shoes, but the moment was too heavy for sarcasm. Instead, I reached forward and slid the rest of the envelope's contents out onto the patio table in a slow, deliberate motion. Property records, refinancing agreements, investment account disclosures, business ownership filings, tax documents going back nearly a decade, every single one of them carrying a signature he had treated as casually as a doctor signing for a coffee order. Garrett picked up the top document with the unsteady fingers of a man who has just realized the floor is not where he thought it was. It was the refinancing agreement we had signed 6 years earlier, when interest rates dropped, and I suggested we restructure the mortgage to free up money for his fellowship-related travel. He had been in the middle of preparing for a conference presentation that week, and he had signed the paperwork on the kitchen counter while eating reheated lasagna and answering a hospital page. He had not read a single page. He had simply asked me where to sign, and I had pointed, and he had signed, and the document now sitting in his hand explicitly identified financial contributions from both spouses, with my name listed as a co-borrower and co-owner. His eyes moved across the page once, then again, slower this time, and I watched the realization climb up his spine, vertebra by vertebra. His phone buzzed against the glass tabletop, the screen lighting up with a name I recognized only from late-night glimpses I had pretended not to see. Sloan. He silenced it without looking, his attention now completely captured by the paperwork in front of him. Another buzz followed seconds later, then another, the rhythm of a woman who had been expecting a very different kind of Saturday. She was probably texting about brunch reservations, or a weekend trip to Door County, or something equally innocent that would soon feel like an artifact from a vanished future. I almost felt sorry for her, sitting wherever she was sitting, picturing a life that was at that very moment dissolving into legal sediment beneath my husband's trembling hands. Almost. Sympathy is something I have learned to ration carefully. "Why would you include this?" he finally said, holding the refinancing document up, as if I had committed some unspeakable act by writing the truth onto it years earlier. The question was so absurd, I actually had to take a breath before responding, because I did not want my answer to come out as a laugh. "I included it," I told him, "because it was true. That is the only reason any document is ever drafted that way." He stared at me across the table, with the expression of a man who had spent so many years believing his own narrative that the existence of an opposing truth felt like a personal attack. The issue was never the paperwork. The issue was that Garrett had spent a decade assuming that facts only existed when they served him, and that anything contradicting his preferred version of reality could be dismissed by sheer force of confidence. "You did not earn what I earned." He said it almost as if it were an apology to himself, a way of explaining to his own ego why this was happening. The words sat between us like a small, sharp object I could pick up and examine from several angles. I considered them carefully before answering, because I wanted him to hear me clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. "No," I told him, "you are correct. I did not earn what you earned." And I watched relief flicker across his face for the half-second before I finished the sentence. "I did not earn what you earned," I continued, "because while you were earning that, I was building the life that made earning it possible." His jaw tightened. He looked away. I kept talking, because once the truth begins moving, you do not stop it out of politeness. I reminded him of the 6 months he had studied for his board certification, when he had locked himself in the upstairs office every night, and I had taken over every other functioning part of our existence. I reminded him of the contractor I had managed when the basement flooded the week of his department interview. I reminded him of the family obligations I had absorbed, the insurance renewals I had handled, the tax filings I had assembled, the meals I had prepared and reheated and prepared again so he could eat something resembling food between rotations. He had been free to focus entirely on becoming a successful surgeon because someone else was carrying the weight of becoming a household. That someone had been me, every single day, for 10 consecutive years, without once being thanked in a way that suggested he understood what he was thanking me for. He stood up so abruptly that the patio chair scraped against the stone behind him. He began to pace, his hands moving in agitated half gestures that reminded me of the way patients' families pace in hospital waiting rooms when they are trying to outrun information they do not want to receive. I had seen that pacing many times over the years, the early stages of denial giving way to the slow surrender of acceptance. Garrett moved through each stage in compressed time. Right there on the patio I had landscaped, beside the herb garden I had planted, in the backyard of the house he had spent 10 years calling his. When he finally stopped pacing, he turned back toward me with a question that told me he was no longer arguing with me. He was beginning to argue with the law. "How much," he asked, "of everything is considered marital property?" I almost smiled, because it was the question he should have asked before he announced over morning coffee that I would receive nothing. I shrugged and told him honestly that I did not know, that the answer to that question was exactly what attorneys were for, and the word attorneys hit him the way a cold draft hits an open wound. He understood then, perhaps for the first time, that this conversation was not going to be settled by his charm, or his certainty, or his ability to out-talk me in a kitchen. The law was about to become involved, and the law has never been particularly impressed by the confidence of doctors. He sat back down heavily. His phone buzzed again. He did not even reach for it this time. I learned later, through documents that surfaced during discovery, exactly how his first meeting with the family law attorney went. He arrived at the office of Theodore Halverson, one of the most expensive divorce specialists in downtown Chicago, fully expecting Halverson to confirm what he wanted to believe. He told Halverson that the marriage might not be valid. He told Halverson that most of the assets were in his name alone. He told Halverson that the situation should be resolvable quickly and quietly. Halverson reviewed every document Garrett had brought with him, took notes in a small leather book, and then asked to see the additional records his client's wife had referenced. The meeting that Garrett expected to last 45 minutes stretched into nearly 3 hours, and at the end of it, Halverson removed his reading glasses, set them gently on the desk, and looked at my husband with the calm of a man who had seen this exact situation many times before. "Dr. Brennan," Halverson said, "your problem is not the marriage certificate." Garrett apparently felt a brief flutter of relief, the way a man feels when a doctor tells him the tumor is not the worst possibility. Then Halverson continued, and the sentence that followed became, in Garrett's own later admission, the moment he understood the size of the situation he had walked into. "Your problem," Halverson said, is that your wife appears to have records for everything. Everything. One word, delivered without emphasis, and yet the word itself was the entire conclusion of the meeting. The question was no longer whether we had been legally married, because we obviously had been. The question was now whether the woman my husband had spent a decade underestimating had been quietly documenting the actual architecture of the life they had built together. The answer to that question was already sitting in a yellow envelope on a patio in Naperville. I want to stop for just a moment here, because I know some of you are sitting with something heavy right now. Maybe you just recognized a pattern in your own life. Maybe you just remembered the exact second you realized someone had been lying to you for far longer than you wanted to admit. If this story is hitting close to home, please stay with me, because the part that matters most is still ahead, and I do not want you to miss it. Subscribe so the rest of this story reaches you when it continues, and in the comments tell me about the moment you finally stopped waiting for an apology that was never going to come. I read every single one of those comments, because every single one of them matters. 3 days after the patio conversation, Garrett came home earlier than usual, carrying a thick manila folder under one arm. I was in the kitchen chopping carrots for a soup I did not particularly want to eat, because cooking had become, in those strange in-between days, a kind of meditation. The rhythm of the knife against the cutting board, the hiss of garlic meeting hot olive oil, the familiar choreography my hands knew without instruction, all of it gave me somewhere to put my thoughts while my marriage finished collapsing in slow motion. Garrett dropped the folder onto the counter beside me with a thud that was clearly meant to signal importance. "We need to talk," he said. I did not look up from the carrots. "We have been doing a lot of that lately," I told him, and the knife kept moving in its quiet, steady rhythm. He pulled the refinancing agreement out of the folder again, as if returning to the scene of his confusion might somehow change what was written on the page. "Do you know what my attorney said about this?" he asked, the edge in his voice betraying the calm he was trying to project. I told him I could guess, and I asked whether Halverson had perhaps mentioned that I appeared to have documented everything. The flicker that crossed Garrett's face confirmed it. "You kept records for 10 years, he said, almost accusing, as though record-keeping were a hostile act. I set the knife down carefully, wiped my hands on the dish towel, and looked at him for the first time since he had walked into the kitchen. "I paid taxes for 10 years too," I told him quietly. "Is that also suspicious to you?" He had no answer for that, because there was no answer that did not embarrass him. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, and said the sentence that finally clarified for me how he had truly seen our marriage for years. "You did not earn what I earned." He said it the same way he had said it on the patio, but this time it landed differently, because this time he was not making a confession. He was making a defense. He believed it. He had always believed it. The man I had spent a decade building a life with had been quietly keeping a mental ledger in which my contributions did not count because they had not arrived attached to a paycheck. Every meal, every contract negotiated, every emergency absorbed, every weekend sacrificed, all of it had existed in his mind as background noise to the only soundtrack that mattered, which was the sound of his own career advancing. I sat across from him at the kitchen table and told him calmly that he was right, in the narrowest possible sense, and that he was wrong in every sense that actually mattered. He had not built his career alone. No one builds a career like his alone. Someone is always carrying the rest, and the only difference between marriages that work and marriages that end up on patios with yellow envelopes is whether the person doing the building remembers to look up occasionally and see who is holding the ladder. Garrett listened without interrupting, which was itself something of a miracle. When I finished speaking, he sat very still for a long moment, and then he simply got up, picked up the folder, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. He did not slam the door. The era of slamming doors was over. He simply left, and the silence he left behind felt different from any silence we had ever shared before. A week later, I encountered Sloane Whitaker at the grocery store, which was not a place I expected to meet my husband's mistress, although in retrospect, I am not sure where exactly would have been appropriate. I had stopped in for almond milk and bread, the kind of small mundane errand that anchors you in normalcy when everything else feels unmoored. As I was leaving the store, I spotted Garrett standing near the automatic doors, and beside him stood a woman in her early 30s with the kind of carefully constructed appearance that suggested she had been awake for at least 2 hours preparing for the day. Honey blonde hair in soft waves. A coat that probably cost more than the groceries in my cart. The unmistakable polish of someone who had grown up being told she was special and had never quite stopped believing it. She recognized me before I recognized her, which told me Garrett had shown her my photograph at some point, perhaps even recently. The three of us stood in a small, awkward triangle for several seconds, none of us quite sure who was supposed to speak first. Garrett looked as if he had swallowed a piece of glass. Sloane recovered her composure faster than I expected and extended a tentative, almost ceremonial smile in my direction. "Hollis," she said, the syllables careful, as if she were testing the temperature of a pool with her toe. "Sloane," I replied, and her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You know who I am," she said, and the question was so genuinely confused that I almost felt a flicker of pity for her. "You are the woman my husband is planning to marry," I told her, and at the word husband her expression shifted in a way I will remember for a long time. The polish did not crack, exactly. It simply began to recalculate. The conversation that followed lasted less than 2 minutes, but it was long enough for Sloane to begin asking questions that Garrett very clearly did not want her asking in a public parking lot. She wanted to know when the divorce had been filed, and I told her it had not been. She wanted to know about the legal status of our marriage, and I told her, quite simply, that we had been legally married for 10 years, and that the certificate was on file with the state of Illinois. I watched her eyes move from me to Garrett and back again, and in that small, silent triangulation, I saw something cold and clear and entirely practical settle into her features. She was not heartbroken in that moment. She was calculating. She was running the numbers in her head, the way smart people do when they suddenly realize the investment they thought they were making is not the investment that is actually on the table. She did not say goodbye. She did not say anything else at all. She simply turned and walked away from both of us toward her car, and Garrett stood there watching her go with the expression of a man who had just realized he was holding a very expensive ticket to a show that had already ended. I picked up my grocery bag, said nothing to him, and walked to my own car. I did not look back. I did not need to. Some moments do not require an audience to complete themselves. By the time I reached my driveway, my hands had stopped shaking, and I realized with some surprise that they had only ever been shaking from adrenaline, not from grief. The grief, I understood then, belonged to a chapter that had already ended. In the weeks that followed, their relationship dissolved with the unceremonious efficiency of a business deal that had gone sour. Sloane stopped answering his calls. Sloane stopped meeting him for dinner. Sloane, who had perhaps imagined herself stepping cleanly into the role of a successful surgeon's wife, had discovered that the role came with significantly more legal complications than advertised, and she had no interest in playing through the unpaid promotional period of someone else's divorce. The fantasy Garrett had built in his head, the one in which he stepped lightly out of one marriage and directly into another without disturbing any of his assets, had evaporated. Reality, when it finally arrived, did not knock politely. It simply walked in and sat down in the chair Sloane had vacated. Nearly a month after the patio morning, Garrett showed up at the house alone one evening. He did not call ahead. He simply rang the doorbell, which was its own small concession, because he still had a key. I opened the door and found him standing on the porch, looking visibly diminished, as if some essential air had gone out of him during the previous weeks. The expensive watch was still on his wrist, the well-tailored coat was still on his shoulders, but the man inside the clothes had clearly been through something he had not anticipated. "Sloane left," he said, before I had even invited him in. "I knew," I told him quietly. I let him stand there for a moment longer in the cold autumn air, watching him absorb the fact that he no longer lived in this house, and then I stepped back and let him into the entryway, because cruelty was never the point. The point had only ever been the truth, and the truth was finally beginning to do its work. Winter settled over Naperville the way winter always does in Illinois, slowly at first, and then all at once. the trees bare against a sky the color of brushed pewter. By the time the first real snow arrived in early December, Garrett and I were living entirely separate lives beneath entirely separate roofs. He had rented a luxury apartment in a glass tower near the river in downtown Chicago, the kind of building with a doorman and a rooftop lounge and a monthly rent that would have made a reasonable person reconsider. He told himself the location was practical because of his commute to the hospital. The truth was that his pride could not survive the idea of moving somewhere modest. Pride is an expensive tenant, especially when divorce attorneys are simultaneously sending invoices, and Garrett was learning that lesson, one billing cycle at a time. The divorce itself moved with the steady, unglamorous rhythm of legal reality. There were no dramatic courtroom scenes, no shouted accusations, no surprise witnesses. There were only meetings, financial disclosures, property valuations, retirement account assessments, and an endless flow of paperwork that Garrett, for the first time in his entire adult life, read with painstaking attention. Every page, every clause, every footnote. I sometimes caught myself smiling when our attorneys exchanged the latest round of documents, because the man who had spent a decade signing his name without ever glancing at what came above it had become, almost overnight, the most careful reader in the state of Illinois. The lesson had arrived late, the way important lessons often do, but it had arrived. On a snowy Thursday afternoon in January, I met my closest friend, Delaney Pope, for lunch at a small cafe near the old downtown stretch of Naperville. Delaney and I had known each other for nearly 12 years, long enough that she had witnessed every act of my marriage, including the ones I had not yet recognized as scenes in a longer play. She stirred her coffee with the deliberate slowness of someone preparing to ask a real question, and then she looked at me across the table and asked how I was actually doing, the emphasis on the word actually carrying the weight of our entire friendship. I considered the question carefully because she deserved a real answer, and I told her the truth. I told her that for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally allowed to breathe again, and that the strange thing was that the breathing felt easier, not harder. She nodded slowly, the way she always did when she was rearranging her assumptions in real time, and she told me I looked different. Lighter, younger, even, though she was quick to clarify that she did not mean it in the way younger usually got weaponized against women our age. I laughed, and the laugh surprised me, because I had not realized how rare laughter had become in my own kitchen over the previous several years. The relief I had begun to feel was difficult to articulate to anyone who had not lived through a long, quiet erosion. Garrett had been leaving me emotionally for years before he ever physically left, and the energy required to hold a one-sided marriage together is the kind of fatigue that only lifts when you finally set the marriage down. I had spent so long carrying it that I had forgotten what my own shoulders felt like without it. A few weeks later, I made a decision I had been postponing for nearly a decade. I launched my own consulting business out of the small upstairs office that had once been Garrett's study. The work itself was not new to me. I had spent more than 10 years quietly managing finances, contracts, vendor relationships, and operational logistics, first for our household, and then, increasingly, as informal advice for small business owners I had met through volunteering. Several of them had been telling me for years that I should be charging for what I already knew. Delaney had been telling me even longer. Now, finally, I had the time, the space, and the clarity to actually do it. I built a simple website. I designed business cards in muted, professional colors. I chose a name, Brennan Operations Consulting, because I had decided that my own name belonged to me, whether or not the marriage attached to it had survived. The business started small, the way honest businesses usually do. One client referred 2 more. Those 2 referred 3. Within 4 months, I had a steady roster of small to mid-sized companies that needed exactly the kind of quiet, systematic operational support I had been providing for free inside my own marriage for a decade. The first time a client wired a payment into an account that bore only my name, I sat at my desk and looked at the notification on my phone for a very long time. It was not a large amount, it was not life-changing on its own, but every dollar of it belonged entirely to me, and after years of contributing invisibly to a life someone else considered his, The visibility of that single deposit felt like a small, private revolution. Meanwhile, Garrett's world was undergoing its own quieter transformation, though not the one he would have chosen for himself. His reputation did not collapse spectacularly. Reputations rarely do. What happened instead was slower, and in some ways more permanent. People began to learn the outline of what had happened, not because I launched any campaign, but because hospitals are small social ecosystems, and Naperville is a smaller town than it sometimes pretends to be. Colleagues asked questions. Old friends compared notes. The respected orthopedic surgeon, who had been quietly admired for his steadiness in the operating room, was now also known, in certain rooms, as the man who had told his wife of 10 years that she was entitled to nothing. Some friends remained loyal, others drifted. Most simply began to see him with a new clarity. A reputation almost never falls because of a single act. It changes, because a single act reveals something that was already there. In early March, I attended a charity fundraiser supporting healthcare access for low-income families in the western suburbs. I had volunteered with the organization for years, originally on a quiet committee, then on a slightly less quiet one, and recently on the board itself. The evening was held in a hotel ballroom with chandeliers that had seen better decades, and silent auction tables stocked with local restaurant gift certificates and weekend getaway packages. It was not a glittering Chicago gala. It was an honest Midwestern fundraiser, populated by people who actually intended to do something useful with the money they raised, which was exactly why I loved it. For the first time at one of these events, I was not introduced as Dr. Brennan's wife. I was introduced as Hollis Brennan, board member, consultant, volunteer. The difference was small on paper and enormous in my chest. Near the end of the evening, I stepped outside to the covered entryway for a few minutes of cold air. Snow was drifting down through the streetlights in slow, lazy spirals, the kind of snow that makes parking lots briefly beautiful. I stood there alone for several minutes, watching it fall, when I heard a familiar voice behind me say my name. I turned, and there he was, Garrett. He looked thinner than he had in the fall, not in an unhealthy way, but in the way men look when something inside them has finally rearranged itself. The arrogance that had once arranged his shoulders was gone. He approached slowly, the way you approach an animal you no longer have the right to startle. We stood together in the cold for a long moment, neither of us speaking, the snow falling between us like a quiet third party. "You look good," he finally said. "Thank you," I told him. "You seem happy," he added, and I gave him a small smile and said that I was, because there was no longer any reason to soften the truth for him. He nodded, as though my happiness was a fact he had already heard about from other people, and was now simply confirming for himself. For a long while we just stood there, watching the snow drift across the parked cars. Then, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, he asked me a question I had not prepared for. He asked whether we could have coffee sometime, not as a path back to anything, not as reconciliation, just coffee, a conversation. I studied him for a long moment in the snow-lit evening, and then I told him one coffee. He exhaled in a way that suggested he had not realized he was holding his breath. 3 weeks later, we met at a small independent coffee shop on a side street in downtown Naperville, the kind of place with exposed brick walls, mismatched wooden chairs, and old black and white photographs of the town from the 1940s hanging crookedly behind the counter. I arrived first, because some patterns survive even the end of marriages, and I had spent 10 years being the one who arrived early. Garrett walked in a few minutes later, spotted me immediately, and crossed the room with the careful, deliberate gait of a man who had thought a great deal about what he wanted to say. He sat down across from me, folded his hands together on the table in the same gesture he had used on the patio many months earlier, and for a long moment he simply looked at me. The silence between us was not tense this time. It was honest, which is a different thing entirely. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. I should have said that a long time ago. I did not interrupt him. I had waited a long time to hear those exact words, and I was not about to deflect them into something smaller out of politeness. He told me he had spent months believing the affair was the worst thing he had done. Then he had realized, slowly and reluctantly, that the affair had not been the beginning of anything. The affair had only been the visible end of something that had started years earlier. The real damage, he told me, had begun the day he first allowed himself to believe he was more important than I was. The day he first looked at our marriage and saw a hierarchy instead of a partnership. The day he first started filing my contributions under the mental heading of background, because they had not arrived attached to a billing code. He told me that during one of his consultations, Theodore Halverson had said something to him that had made him furious at the time, and that he had spent weeks turning the sentence over in his head before he had finally been able to hear it properly. Halverson had told him that he had spent his entire marriage confusing income with value. That single sentence, Garrett told me, had eventually unmade him in a way nothing else had managed to do. It had forced him to look honestly at the years between us, at the board exam I had carried him through, at the contractor I had managed during his fellowship interview week, at the 100 quiet emergencies I had absorbed so that he could keep his hands steady in operating rooms full of strangers. He had treated all of it as background. It had been, in fact, the foundation. He told me he should have appreciated me. He told me he should have respected me. His voice cracked a little on the word respected, and I let it crack, because the crack was the realest thing he had offered me in years. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The espresso machine hissed behind the counter. A couple walked past the window holding hands beneath a shared umbrella. Life kept moving around our small table, as it always does. Then I smiled at him gently and asked him whether he knew what the funny part was. He looked up, confused, and I told him. The yellow envelope. A small, sad smile crossed his face. The famous yellow envelope, he said, and he laughed quietly without any humor in it. I hate that envelope, he added. Most people would, I told him. Then I said something he clearly was not expecting. The envelope, I told him, did not destroy your life. He looked up sharply. I continued. You did. Not cruelly, not angrily, just honestly, because the documents in that envelope had always existed. The signatures had always been his. The warnings had always been there. The envelope had not created any consequences. It had only revealed the ones he had been quietly accumulating for years, one careless decision at a time. Before I tell you how this ends, I want to ask you one thing, because the story is almost over, and the next part belongs as much to you as it does to me. If this story has reached someone you love, someone who has spent years quietly holding a household together while being told her contributions did not count, please share this video with her, because sometimes the only thing a woman needs is to hear that someone else saw the things she was carrying. And in the comments below, tell me what you would say to the person who once underestimated you, the person who looked right past you for years and only saw you clearly when the cost finally arrived at their door. I read those comments. I learned from them. Every single one of them matters more than you know. The divorce settlement was finalized 2 months later, on an unremarkable Tuesday, in a quiet conference room in downtown Chicago. The outcome was not dramatic. Nobody lost everything. Nobody walked away destroyed. The assets were divided according to the law, according to documented contributions, according to what had actually been built and by whom. I received exactly what I deserved, which was neither more nor less than what the decade of paperwork showed I had contributed. Garrett retained enough to continue his career and rebuild his future, which was, I think, the right outcome, because the goal had never been to ruin him. The goal had always been the truth. Real justice is not destruction. Real justice is fairness, which is something our culture has somehow forgotten how to recognize when it is not loud. Over the following year, my consulting business grew steadily, then more than steadily. New clients arrived through referrals, and then through referrals of referrals, and eventually through partnerships I had not gone looking for. The charity board asked me to chair a committee, and then to lead a strategic planning initiative. My life filled up not because I was trying to outrun Garrett, but because I had finally stopped narrating my days around someone else's calendar. Garrett, from what I heard through the small Naperville grapevine, became a different doctor in the months that followed. Not necessarily more technically skilled. He had always been skilled. He became more patient, more careful, more present. Pain, it turns out, is one of the few teachers that the human ego is genuinely willing to learn from. 18 months after the divorce was finalized, I attended a mentoring event for women re-entering the workforce after major life transitions. Divorce, widowhood, caregiving years, career interruptions of every kind. Every woman in that room carried a different story and the same quiet question underneath it, which was whether her years of invisible work had been worth anything. During a break, a younger woman named Juniper Hayes approached me with the hesitant energy of someone who had been working up the courage all afternoon. She told me her husband had been telling her for years that because he earned all the money, everything in their lives belonged to him. She asked me what I thought. I looked at her for a long moment and saw a younger version of myself standing there, uncertain, wondering whether her contributions counted because they had never arrived with a paycheck attached. I told her, gently, that she must never let anyone convince her that what she contributed did not matter, simply because someone else's contribution came with a number printed on it. A healthy partnership, I told her, is not built on who earns more. It is built on respect. She nodded slowly, the way you nod when something true reaches a place inside you that has been waiting a long time to hear it. I drove home that evening through a soft spring rain, and when I walked into my own house, the one that now belonged entirely to me, I went upstairs to the office that had once been Garrett's study and opened the second drawer of the filing cabinet. The yellow envelope was still there, exactly where I had returned it after the settlement. I pulled it out and held it in both hands for a moment, the way I had held it on that Saturday morning years earlier. It was lighter now, or maybe I was. I set it down on the desk, did not seal it, did not lock the drawer, did not put it away. I simply left it sitting there in the soft lamplight, open, finished, no longer a weapon, no longer a secret, just paper that had finally finished its work. Then I walked downstairs, opened the back door, and stepped out onto the patio where everything had once ended, and where, without my quite noticing when, everything had also begun again.